Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank the organizers in the Alaska Historical Society for this opportunity to present my research this afternoon. Yake Wustini, Shaudnegi, Anyet Gusani, Aktawasi Chish. I'd like to thank the Dena'ina people for on whose lands the meetings are being held, Chish. I'd like to also thank the Tlingit people for on whose land I present and read my paper, Chish. It seems fitting at this Alaska Historical Society's conference, where the theme is connections and disconnections in Alaska history, to talk about connections and disconnections in the justice system in Southeast Alaska for Tlingit people. It also seems fitting that when the Alaska Historical Society meetings are held on the Kenai Peninsula, that I, as an anthropologist, talk about social justice issues, a topic and a tribute to my colleague, Alan Boros, who was an advocate for the Dena'ina and Kenaitze rights and recognition. Chish, here's to Alan. My research for my paper today began over 30 years ago when I was living and working in Saxman in Ketchikan. Tongass Tontaquan Tlingit elders told me oral histories of their clan leaders, Hitsatis, who were fierce defenders of their property and resource rights. In more than one case, some of these Hitsatis were outspoken about their rights and their clan's rights, and at some point in their life were arrested, and some of them ended up being sent to Morningside Asylum Hospital Sanatorium in Oregon. The Tlingit elders were very candid about the fact that the local and federal government arrested the clan Hitsatis leaders to silence them and remove them in order that non-natives could take away land and resources from the Tlingit. Some of the elders who were related to the Hitsatis said, but we don't talk about it anymore. To me, this chapter in Tlingit history reminded me of the teaching of one of my mentors from the University of Chicago, Ray Fogelson. I have shared some of these thoughts with this society in the past. Ray Fogelson, an anthropologist and ethnohistorian who worked among the Cherokee, wrote about historical trauma. Fogelson, who specialized in psychological anthropology, was one of the first ethnohistorians to discuss history and historical trauma. In his keynote address to the American Society for Ethnohistory in 1988, he said and wrote, "There are events and non-events." In this work, he critically discussed the intellectual history of historians through their definitions and uses of events. This part of his paper was witty and interesting critical analysis, but not groundbreaking. What was insightful is his construction of the term non-events in the impacts of historical trauma. Fogelson writes, "The absence of indigenous peoples from documents or non-events are the deliberate," and I quote here, "the deliberate adopting of low-profile invisibility as a defensive strategy to avoid possible discrimination, persecution, conscriptions, and perceived threats to their autonomy." He adds, "One form of non-events concerns the differential recognition of what is considered eventful. The example he gives is whether the American Revolution was a real event for American Indians or an unmarked interval in a continuing series of struggles that had begun long before 1776 and would continue after the surrender at Yorktown. More cryptically, did the revolution for the Indians only represent the paternal substitution of George I for George III? Another type of non-event that is relevant to our discussion of Tlingit leaders being arrested and sent to Morningside or other places, involves events that occur and can be documented, but are so traumatic they are denied. He says, as historians, we should ask new questions, arrange new narrative plots to try and explain the Native silence, if not total amnesia surrounding these horrendous events. As I have urged folks before this society before, I think that those who are doing work on the history of Alaska should think about historical trauma and its impact on future generations and become more involved in these discussions. And I'm kind of inspired by what seems to be coming forward with the society of these forthcoming discussions that will happen periodically. The Tlingit Hitsatis each dealt with the pressures from the 1880s to the 1900s differently. In the rest of my paper, I will look at 3 different cases and how they played out. One particular case, and this one, let's move up to the photo of Donawak. This one is just a picture of Sitka 1881, where the early US bureaucrats kind of enlisted Tlingit people to be kind of deputized police officers. Next slide, please. One particular case where a Tlingit Hitsati took a stand against the infringement of their fishing rights was on the Chilkoot River. There were many others, but this one is one of the best documented cases in the Bureau of Fisheries agents' records. In 1901, Mosier talks about a particular meeting with the Chilkoot Kwan. And here I quote from him. During my visit to Chilkoot, at the head of Lynn Canal, I participated in a very imposing and formal ceremony which outclassed anything of the sort in former experiences. It has often happened that the natives have had grievances to relate and appeals to make, but these have always been individual or half a dozen at most. On this occasion, however, practically the whole tribe took an active part in the interview. He goes on to say that Chilkoot Indians were once a powerful tribe and have been distinguished from other native Alaskans by a reputation of aggressive ferocity that would not brook any encroachment upon or to their rights. In all their dealing with the whites, they have prudently refrained from the insolently forceful methods that could be employed with impunity against most natives. Chilkoots are much superior in physique to the average Alaskan, and also in former times were reputed to be the richest of any, the place they occupied being possibly more prolific in food and furs than other tribal grounds. There has never been any outbreak against whites of recent years, and diplomatic means have apparently accomplished quite as much as force with other tribes to crowd them little by little their old possessions and privileges. End of quote. In response to an invitation by the fish commissioner, Jefferson Mosier, the Chilkoot came to the Alaskan cutter, and he says, like an army with banners, unquote. They approached the Grant in 2, and here again quoting, great war canoes, perhaps 30 feet in length, end of quote. In the bow of the canoes were Hitsatis, or clan leaders in, as he said, full regalia. Moser states, once alongside the Grant, a gangway was put down for the party to come aboard. Among the contingent who Mosier noted were 2 Hitsatis, a tottering old man who was stone blind, a young interpreter who talked quite fluent English, and the chief's daughter who was neatly dressed and was described as the, quote, school marm of the village. Mosier concluded his discussion of this case by stating, they professed and here I quote, "They profess to be totally law-abiding, and I was strongly impressed with the belief that as a whole they are. They struck me as being about the most manly and honest of a lot of natives I have found in the country. Whatever may be the true explanation of the particular conditions of things which inspired the formidable powwow, their conduct in the premises left no room for doubt that they believed that they were being wrong and were entitled to be defended against the imposition." End of quote. What Moser witnessed was Tlingit protocol and formality. The Hitsotis demanded a meeting with the commissioner, and they were attempting to instruct him that the Chilkoot River and the rights to fish that river were At'u, their property. The regalia that the chiefs wore would have had clan crests that were also At'u, which to them in Tlingit culture represent carrying their legal title, like as if carrying their deeds with them of the Chilkoot River. Their speeches would have tied together the connection of their history to the place, they asserting in a Tlingit way that this was their land and river, that only they had first entitlement to the resources and should be compensated by others who used the area. Moser, of course, asserted the democratic ideals of open and equal access to resources. I think I'll skip my second case study because I'm not really sure where we stand on time, and we got a little late of a start. So I can always come back to that one. But I want to go to my third case study, which is the one from the Ketchikan area. And this one represents a very different kind of interaction and a very different kind of end result. The case I will end with is the oral history of a Tlingit Hitsati, and we can go to the next slide. Let's go to a few more till we get to the pole of the Tongass. There we go. The case I will end with is the oral history of a Tlingit Hitsati of the Tontaquan Ganakati clan. For the Ganakati clan, their clan territory encompassed areas such as Annette Island and the area around the Ketchikan area. In 1899, Seattle businessmen who were visiting Southeast Alaska went to Tongass Island and cut down one of this clan leader's lineage poles, a Raven Memorial pole that was dedicated to a Tongass woman named Chief of All Women. These businessmen took it back to Seattle and placed it in Pioneer Square in Seattle. This is actually the second rendition of the pole carved by CCC carvers in the 1930s and 40s. Next slide. In Ketchikan from 1900 to 1903, Sutter and Heckman built a sawmill and worked to acquire as many titles for land along the tidal flats as they could. There were many land disputes over these tidelands between 1900 and 1902, including the city of Ketchikan versus Sutter and Heckman. The city was attempting to protect the tideland because they had a city baseball field on those lands. In my dissertation years ago, I entitled that chapter Fields of Dreams, Nightmares of Trespass for the Tongass. Finally, on December 10th, 1903, George Bon Kinninuk was arrested. The Tontaquan people say he was arrested because he was an important landholder and was not willing to forfeit his clan's property. Family members say there was no explanation why he was arrested and taken away. His clan property included areas like Annette Island and the Ketchikan area. Annette Island, of course, was in question because that was an area given to a place to set up a place for the Shimshan Indians, natives, indigenous peoples who were moving from old Metlakatla, British Columbia. In 1993, I was doing research for the Tongass tribe at the Federal Archives in Anchorage. I was accompanied by a Tongass elder, and we were examining the Morningside asylum records. In the Morningside documents, we began recognizing Tongass Tlingit names. One such name was George Kinninuk. There we saw that he was admitted to Morningside because he had been convicted of being criminally insane. I looked at these microfilm rolls that were phrased or labeled Crystal Springs Sanatorium, and he was admitted February 8th, 1904. There were also two other Tlingit Tontaquan leaders, John McKay and Charlie Cloche, who were committed a bit later to Morningside. In the documents, it actually said one place that they were insane and speaking in tongues, something that wouldn't be uncommon for Tlingit Hitsati to be knowledgeable and conversant in more than one language during that time period. Tlingit in the Ketchikan area, many of them were conversant in Shimshan or Shimelgic, you might say, and Haida, and hopefully possibly a little bit of English. So speaking in tongues is yet kind of a questionable thing. For years, I've been looking for more court records to get a better understanding of how and why George Kinninuk was arrested. And just 4 days ago, researching for this paper while working at the State Archives in Juneau, I was looking through the criminal and civil cases, record group 21, the records of the district courts for the United States, Ketchikan Court. And finally, in volume number 1 of 14 different dockets, they're labeled civil dockets, March 22nd, 1900 to February 19th, 1960. I finally found on page 32 reference to case 16K. And it said, and you have the page that I just saw on Monday, in the matter of inquiry to the sanity of George Kinninuk, an Indian, September 10th, 1903, complaint filed. September 10th, 1903, order for warrant entered and field. September 10th, 1903, warrant issued. September 10th, 1903, warrant refund served and filed. September 10th, 1903, order of commitment entered. September 10th, 3 certified copies of order of commitments made. And then finally for September 10th, medical certificate filed. And the last entry there is October 7th, 1903, commitment, and it was hard to read, refund, or I'm not quite sure the wording there. Basically October 7th, 1903, commitment filed. During this time, for most Tlingit, being committed to these native sanatoriums was almost as sure as a death sentence. Many, if not most, did not come home. The poor living conditions, epidemics of infectious diseases circulated through the patients in these facilities, and separation from family and kin support resulted in an extremely high mortality rate. Also, as I told you, in 1904, 2 other Tontaquan leaders, John McKay and Charlie Close, were committed to Morningside. George Kinninuk died at Mount Tabor, September 26, 1907. And I think I meant time, so I better stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. And I apologize for the mix-up at the beginning there, but thank you for starting over again and doing your presentation.
Yeah,
Okay.
thanks for being patient and keep persevering.
Next up, we have Rebecca Polson, who's an artist and writer in Sitka, who has been working to record and share Sitka's history. She is on the boards of the Sitka Maritime Heritage Society and the Alaska Historical Society. She publishes the Outer Coast Calendar of Art and Poetry and is a member of the Alaska Historical Commission. Rebecca has lately been taking a deep dive into the history of Sheldon Jackson School and College, and has just published Sitka, Alaska, A Short History with the Sitka Maritime Heritage Society. Her talk today is focused on Presbyterians in Tlingit America.
Thank you. So Presbyterian missions and missionaries came to southeastern Alaska in the late 1870s and helped shape Alaska in a formative period. The Presbyterian missionaries developed an image of the native people of southeastern Alaska. This narrative was propagated in historical writing in the 20th century and is still with us in the 21st century. So Presbyterians came to Alaska in the late 1870s, a decade after the United States took over Alaska in 1867. In the late 1870s, Tlingit leaders were asking for missions, and some Tlingit leaders joined the church. The story is that Native people were suffering due to the introduction of alcohol and the disruption of traditional culture and subsistence way of life, and needed help, but it doesn't fit. Industrial takings of land did not get underway until the 1880s, and alcohol abuse is a symptom, not a cause of loss. So what was really going on? And so first, I'm going to talk about the background for the social and economic world of southeastern Alaska in the late 1870s that the missionaries found. I'll sketch the missionary interpretation of Tlingit culture and society. And then I'll share briefly how missionary accounts were taken up by historians in the late 20th, or a historian in the late 20th century. Then even more briefly, an example of a 21st century work. And then finally, I'll try to talk about a way forward. So first, the maritime fur trade, which was a century before this time, is often left out of the story. Slide. And slide. Indigenous civilizations owned all of Northwest America with a robust economy and trade networks. In 1780s, American and other traders came to the Northwest coast for sea otter furs, and they used indigenous protocol in their trading. And the trade brought great wealth to this region and to Boston. Sorry, slide. Yeah. And then two is the impact of smallpox and other epidemics, which killed so many people. I'm going to slide. Killed so many people that by 1867, the population of southeastern Alaska was just a fraction of what it had been at the start of the century. So smallpox was devastating due to limited or no access to inoculation, but other diseases also had a disproportionate impact on indigenous groups. And perhaps this was because the impact of smallpox left groups vulnerable. And then third, and the one is we don't know why these diseases had such a huge impact. And then three is the Russians. The next element is the nature of the Russian colonization of southeastern Alaska. So Russians entered Alaska with great violence in the mid-1700s, and by the 1780s established themselves with a model in which their profits depended on underpaying an indigenous workforce based in the Aleutian, Pribilof, and Kodiak Islands. So by the time the Russians had wiped out the otters in that region in the mid-1790s and came to southeastern Alaska, Sitka Sound was a regular port of call for trading ships. The Tlingit Texeti leader Shkakhokye granted Russians a hunting base near Sitka in 1799. In subsequent battles that resulted in a peace in 1805, in which Russians were permitted to stay. But Russians never controlled southeastern Alaska in spite of their occupation of Sitka. They were in southeastern Alaska primarily to claim territory against the US, England, and other European nations. Tlingit leaders benefited from the additional competition between the Russians and other traders, and by supplying the new Archangel colony. And this is very well documented in all the Russian histories, letters, everything. And it's often misunderstood because it was portrayed in a very different way after the fact. And then 4 is the situation in the Northwest coast in the mid-1800s. Tlingit leaders from Southeast Alaska regularly traveled to the Salish Sea for trade. Now, in southern coastal British Columbia, colonists were displacing native people, backed by the military, which included, and this was what they called gunboat diplomacy, destruction of villages and canoes. In Washington Territory by the mid-1850s, all native people were forced off of their lands and onto reservations. The mid-1850s through the 60s saw multiple violent interactions between native people in the military, British and American. And in a way, southeastern Alaska under the Russians was almost a haven of indigenous control. And slide. The fur trade was the economic lifeblood of southeastern Alaska for indigenous and Russian traders alike. The trade was less valuable after sea otter were decimated by the 1810s, but it seems to have crashed by 1867. Some of this was due to changing fashions, markets, and probably overhunting. And in addition, the United States experienced the Long Depression, which officially dated from 1873. A recession in Europe at the same time also helped depress the fur market. With the American occupation in 1867, the economy cratered. The Russian-American company had been putting resources into southeastern Alaska economy by paying employees, buying furs, food, and labor. The U.S. Army force had fewer people and imported more of their supplies. And so for the next decade, 1867-77, Sitka's economy was dependent on the Army payroll and supplying prospectors. And the main item of trade in that decade was alcohol, which was probably an indication of the state of the economy, the way drugs and other illicit trade dominates economically depressed places today. And in addition, Tlingit traders were pushed out of what trade there was. American traders were suddenly everywhere and took over the internal Southeast Alaska trade. The Tlingit control of the Stikine River trade was weakened by an 1862 gold strike in the interior and then destroyed in the 1872 Cassiar gold rush. So the state of the economy probably contributed to the horrific numbers of premature deaths. By 1867, the population was less than 8,000 and falling. At Stikine, an American survey said that the population had been about 1,500 only a few years before, but was only 1,000 and falling in 1867. And then a sixth factor is military force in the late that shaped Alaska in the late 1870s. So the military that came in was hardened by the recent Civil War, but more than that, by the Indian Wars in the lower states, which was then at their height. The so-called Cape War in 1869, the USS Saginaw shelled the 3 Cape villages and burned all the houses but one to the ground, a total of 28 clan houses, many of them 30 or 40 feet square. They destroyed canoes and even poisoned food, destroyed food. So the American military, unlike the Russians, did not rely on diplomacy and relied on force. And at Wrangell, later in 1869, the army shelled the village of Kashf-an-Ak. So the Presbyterians, and slide. Oh, slide. Oh, sorry, right. Yeah, that was similar. Sorry about that. So the earliest Protestant missionaries in Alaska were a group of Methodist Simpson men at Wrangell during the Cassiar Gold Rush of the mid-1870s. Presbyterian missionary Sheldon Jackson brought missionary Amanda McFarland to Wrangell in 1877, where she started a girls' home. I think that's the next slide. One more, yes. Then in 1878, he sent missionary John Brady and teacher Fanny Kellogg to Sitka, where they started a day school. S. Hall Young arrived at Wrangell in 1878. In 1879, naturalist John Muir went with missionary S. Hall Young from Wrangell to northern southeastern Alaska to missionize and to look at glaciers. And so what did these missionaries find? And what they found was consistently, and with few exceptions, leaders were asking for schools that they offered to help build, and for sawmills and lumber that they wanted to buy. And all of them brought up the Christian community of Metlakatla in Canada. So Anglican missionary William Duncan went to Fort Simpson on the Skeena River in 1856. He gained a following that included clan leaders. These people then built a town at Metlakatla near Prince Rupert. At this new village, within a few years, they had a sawmill and brand new frame houses. And they also escaped the 1862 smallpox epidemic with only a few fatalities, which was it devastated the coast. Methodist missionaries also had mission schools and sawmills in other villages. In 1879, Presbyterian missionary Alonzo Austin came to Sitka, and his daughter restarted the day school for natives in 1880. And teachers, all of these teachers found students quick to learn. A boarding school was started at Sitka at the request of some of the students, the boys, who included sons and nephews of important clan leaders. Slide, 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 and slide. So this includes the young man in the front, second from the left, is he was given the name Rudolph Walton, and later he was called Kawut, and he was important leader of the Kikseti. So native leaders were asking for missions in schools, important clans were sending their leaders, and this initial success did not last. It did not last very long. So how did missionaries describe these native people? So back in 1867, Americans brought a conception of native people as savage, whose history and society are simple, whose arts are natural, who live off the land without exertion or technology. So missionaries added to this. In his book, Alaska and Missions of the North Pacific Coast in 1880, Sheldon Jackson told tales of extreme depravity and despair, and told how it was proximity to white communities that caused dependence on and destruction from alcohol. The late 1870s saw a lot of violence, alcohol abuse, and crime in native and in non-native communities. The extreme portrayal of depravity and vulnerability was contrasted with descriptions of native ability and interest in English Christianity and the perfect canoes and other that craftsmen made. And the narrative was that native culture could not withstand contact with white culture, especially alcohol. The missionary goal was to protect native people from themselves by eradicating the culture. So the early success of the Sitka mission begat more funds and probably helped Sheldon Jackson in his quest for political interest in Washington, D.C. And the description of Tlingit people stuck. And this was taken up in the late 20th century. In Ted Hinckley's book, The Canoe Rocks, he describes Tlingit history of the 19th century as a story of acculturation caused by a desire for trade goods, which led to the thirst for alcohol and even contributed to the depredations of diseases. Again, he described the problems that Tlingit people were having at this time as the culture not being able to withstand contact with white culture. And his is the main source for anyone looking for information about Tlingit people in the years after 1867. Now, in this century, this is just one example, a book published by the University of Alaska Press about this era. The author is loose with the facts, and even his citations from Hinckley are distorted in the direction of portraying Tlingit people as fierce, retributive, overly impressed by white leaders, and ultimately doomed when they cannot protect the old ways. So how does this narrative differ from one based on what we know of the context of the late 19th century? So Tlingit culture is very different from European culture, but missionaries portrayed it as what made people vulnerable to destruction just from contact with certain aspects of white culture. They saw Tlingit suffering and blamed it on the weak culture. And we can see that the economy, the impact of major smallpox epidemics, Americans pushing Tlingit people out of the economy, refusing rights or recognition of ownership, are more likely factors behind the violence and alcohol abuse of the late 1870s. To move forward, slide. We not only have to question narratives of history that rely on a stereotype, but also, even as history helps us understand broadly what we are today, we have to resist creating new stereotypes. For instance, by assuming all members of a group are this or that. We all need respect in our schools, homes, and communities. Native culture is incredibly rich, Native history incredibly complex. And let's approach it with eyes wide open and not with the blinders of stereotype.
Thank you, Rebecca. And now for our final speaker, Bill Youngs is a professor of American history at Eastern Washington University, where he teaches several environmentally themed courses, notably the history of national parks and the history of the American wilderness. He's published 5 books and is currently working on 2 projects. One is an anthology to be called Klondike Voices, and the second is a history of the underappreciated Washburn-Langford expedition that led to the formation of Yellowstone National Park. Today he's going to speak on early Alaska tourism and the encounter with Alaska natives during the 1880s and early 1890s.
You have a slide?
No, I do not.
Oh, good. Okay. Picture. I'm the first person I will have heard today that doesn't have slides. And so I'm hoping through my words, and if not through my words, through John Muir, we'll be quoting a fair amount to provide you some images to make up for that. When we think of Alaska tourism today, we think of huge ocean liners carrying thousands of passengers each. Little do we know about early tourism in Alaska, circa 1860, I'll get it right, 1880 to 1895, when diminutive steamships would bring fewer passengers to Alaska during an entire season than a modern ocean liner brings in a single voyage. But these earlier tours did much to publicize Alaska in the early years, soon after it became an American territory, and they established ways and challenges of seeing Alaska and other regions that endure to this day. One person in particular nurtured this early tourism, John Muir, who is best known for having explored and publicized Yosemite. After spending 12 years studying and writing about the Sierras, Muir first journeyed to Alaska in 1879. He was immediately smitten with the beauty of the territory. Of his journey through the Alexander Archipelago on the way to Fort Wrangell, he wrote, "To the lover of pure wildness, Alaska is one of the most wonderful countries in the world. No excursion that I know of may be made into any other American wilderness, where so marvelous an abundance of noble, newborn scenery is so charmingly brought to view as on the trip through the Alexander Archipelago to Fort Wrangell and Sitka." Never before this have I been embosomed in scenery so hopelessly beyond description. As Muir traveled further north, he was all the more impressed by Alaska's scenery with its natives and with its natives. During his Alaska travels, Muir wrote accounts and delivered lectures with his impressions of the territory and its people. Among other accomplishments, in the company of Indian guides and a Presbyterian missionary, he discovered Glacier Bay, the high point of modern American tours to Alaska. During the next few minutes, I will review Muir's portrait of Alaska on the brink of early tourism. This review of what Muir saw in 1879 and 1880 will provide a reference point for later in my talk when I explore what early tourists did and did not experience of Alaska and its native life during their own encounters with the territory. John Muir was, of course, interested in the Alaskan landscapes. He had recently published controversial articles claiming that glaciers sculpted the contours of Yosemite Valley, and he was eager to learn more about Alaskan glaciers. At the time, Josiah Whitney, California state geologist, claimed that the valley had been formed when the Sierra Nevada sank into a great hole. Muir quipped, "The bottom never dropped out of anything that God made." He found living glaciers in the deep recesses of the Sierras. Unconvinced, Whitney characterized the young Muir as a mere sheep herder and an ignoramus. But Muir was correct. And in Alaska, he delighted in seeing glaciers much grander than the remnants in the Sierras. And on the rock walls above the Alaskan glaciers, he saw evidence of many Yosemites being carved. After arriving at Fort Wrangell, Muir made 2 trips by steamer farther into Alaska. On a journey up the Stikine River to a gold mining district, he saw many glaciers, which he described as so striking and beautiful that they are admired even by the passing miners with gold dust in their eyes. Soon after returning to Wrangell, he took another trip, joining a group of Presbyterian missionaries on a journey of preaching and exploration up the Alaska coast. At one stop, he decided to climb a 7,000-foot mountain to sketch the nearby glaciers. It was already 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and so he would have to hike about 15 miles and climb those 7,000 feet. One of the missionaries, Samuel Hall Young, persuaded Muir to take him along. They were on their way to the summit when Hall stumbled and dislocated both shoulders. Muir then spent the entire night helping his injured friend back to the boat. The exploit is one measure John Muir's obsession with seeing wild Alaska. He later wrote, "The grandeur of these forces and their glorious results overpower me and inhabit my whole being. Waking or sleeping, I have no rest. In dreams, I read blurred sheets of glacial writing, or follow lines of cleavage, or struggle with difficulties of some extraordinary rock form of understanding and explaining." In these early accounts by Muir, we see glimpses, but only glimpses, of native life. One such glimpse is this description of a morning at Fort Wrangell. Muir writes, "Yonder you see a canoe gliding out from the shore, containing perhaps a man, a woman, and a child or 2, all paddling together in natural, easy rhythm. Others skim along the shores to fish and hunt and trade, or merely to visit their neighbors, for they are very sociable." In a deserted village, Muir admired the signs of Indian craftsmanship displayed on totem poles. They were carved, he writes, into life-size figures of men, women, and children, fishes and birds, and various other animals. And Muir continues, "With the same tools, not 1 in 1,000 of our skilled mechanics could do as good work." Not 1 in 1,000 of our skilled mechanics could do as good work. In such descriptions, Muir is an admiring outsider, writing about the Indians rather than living among them. But a third journey of exploration in 1879 was entirely different. This time, he joined his now recovered friend, Samuel Hall Young, in a canoe with 4 Alaska natives for a remarkable paddle of about 800 miles. Muir introduces us by name to his indigenous traveling companions, including Toyota, who he tells us was a grand old Stikine nobleman, was made captain, not only because he owned the canoe, but for his skill in woodcraft and seamanship. On the long journey, they paddled together, camped together, and told stories together. Muir recounts a notable conversation. I was enjoying the Indians' campfire talk this evening, he writes, on their ancient customs, how they were taught by their parents ere the whites came among them, their religion, ideas connected with the next world, the stars, planets, etc. When our talk was interrupted by a howling wolf on the opposite side of the street, Kadachin, one of the Indians, puzzled the minister with the question, have wolves souls? And depending on the questions after the talk, I maybe will give you the answer that came up with. In addition to bonding with his native companions in the canoe, Muir met many other native Alaskans during visits to their villages along the shore. He was especially impressed with the solicitudes the natives showed their children. He writes, it seems wonderful to me that these so-called savages, can make one feel at home in their families, in good breeding, intelligence, and skill in accomplishing whatever they try to do with tools. They seem to me to rank above most of our uneducated white laborers. I've never yet seen a child ill-used, even to the extent of an angry word. Scolding, so common a curse in civilization, is not known here at all. On shore, Muir and Hall spoke to attentive audiences in many villages. Muir writes, at our last meeting, an old white-haired shaman of grave venerable aspect arose and spoke. I am an old man, he said, but I'm glad to listen to these strange things you tell. I remember the first white man I ever saw. Since that long, long time ago, I've seen many, but until now, I've never truly known and felt a white man's heart. I might say that through all my long life, I have never until now heard a white man speak. It has always seemed to me that while trying to speak to traders and those seeking gold mines, that it was like speaking to a person across a broad stream, that scarce a single word could be heard. But now, for the first time, the Indian and the white man are on the same side of the river, eye to eye, heart to heart. That river image applies well to Muir's experience with his comrades in the canoe, as well as the Indians in the settlements. They parted, he tells us, as fellow travelers and even friends. Winter was coming on, and soon Muir was on a steamship heading back to the States. He began immediately, through lectures and newspaper articles, to describe what he had seen in the far north. One of my favorite of these articles was dispatched to the Portland Oregonian from someone who had heard him speak in Vancouver, Washington. John Muir, he wrote, spent a portion of the day making sketched diagrams, which were skillfully executed in chalk upon a blackboard and being numbered, answered his briefs, kind of an early version of the slideshow, I guess. These served as illustrations for Muir's talk that evening on glaciers and glacial action. The correspondent noted that Muir's lecture held the attention of the audience without interruption for upwards of 2 hours. Hard to do. Now comes my favorite part of this report. John Muir's whole face lit up, as he talked of the youth of the world, the present morning of creation, the beginning of the world, the work of the infinite. I wish the reporter continued. I could give you the sublime passage near its close, where he makes the storms, the winds, the avalanches, the earthquakes, and all natural phenomena deemed by man terrific, the simple instruments in the hands of a limitless power, producing only beauty and harmony. This was one of the first reports of one of John Muir's most famous statements, his words about the morning of creation. Some of you may recognize that, are nested beautifully in the prologue to what I consider the greatest book and documentary we have about our national parks. Ken Burns and David Duncan's magnificent production, The National Parks, America's Best Idea. So that starts with this passage from Muir as it further developed it. Soon after Muir returned from Alaska, he was besieged with invitations to lecture, and his newspaper articles were widely published and republished. He wrote his fiancée, Louise Stretzel, I've allowed myself to be entangled in the snarl of lectures. Before long, Americans by the hundreds, then by the thousands, began to visit Alaska. They took advantage of a tourism infrastructure that had grown up in the United States after the Civil War. With the completion of the transcontinental railways during the 19th century, companies like Raymond and Whitcomb in Boston created tourist packages for trips to Yellowstone and Yosemite. By 1890, some of these transcontinental railway tours included extensions by ocean liner to Alaska. Raymond and Whitcomb, for example, offered Western trips of 2 to 3 months, promising Pullman, vegetables, sleeping, and dining cars, followed by an ocean voyage to Alaska in the popular steamer Queen. The steamship companies, as well as individual authors, published guidebooks to the wonders of Alaska. The author of the best known of these books, Eliza Skidmore, credited John Muir as her inspiration. These guidebooks and tours themselves succeeded in introducing travelers to the Alaskan landscapes, including Glacier Bay. But what of tourist exposure to Alaskan natives? The challenge of introducing visitors to indigenous practices and beliefs was, and arguably still is, one of the great challenges of tourism. As we've seen from Muir's account, an ideal approach would consist of traveling in a canoe with Alaskan Native companions, sleeping weeks and paddling and camping with them, exchanging stories by firelight and starlight, and visiting native villages along the way. But no tour company offered anything like that sort of immersion in indigenous cultures. As might be expected, tourist contact with Native Alaskans was almost exclusively in the form of shopping for curios. Even this activity was skewed by tourist appetites. During stops at Sitka, Wrangell, and Juneau, one could indeed purchase items crafted by Native Alaskans, but in some cases it turned out that these authentic items were actually manufactured in New England for sale in Alaska. One is reminded of the revelation recently at Grand Canyon National Park that some of the so-called Navajo artifacts sold there were actually manufactured in China. Guide writer Eliza Skidmore complained that the work of one notable craftsman at Fort Wrangell had been compromised by the tourist trade. The best silver bracelets, she wrote, at Fort Wrangell are made by a lame Indian who, as chief artificer and silversmith of the tribe, has quite a local reputation. His bracelets are beautifully decorated, but unfortunately for the integrity of Stickeen art traditions, he has given up on carving the emblematic beast of native heraldry on heavy barbaric wristlets, and now only makes the most slender bangles adopted from the modes of an illustrated jeweler's catalog some Philistine has sent him. And one can only shake his head sadly to see Stickeen art so corrupted and debased. A similar process of altering native cultures while viewing them was occurring elsewhere in the United States at the time. At Glacier National Park, for example, Blackfoot Indians were rebranded as the Indians of Glacier and taught to greet tourists in supposedly traditional ways. And at Niagara Falls, so-called Indians greeted tourists in what reportedly sounded suspiciously like an Irish brogue. Irishmen posed as Indians. During the middle of the 19th century, artist George Catlin had suggested that a large section of the country should be set aside as an Indian land to serve to preserve indigenous culture. That, of course, never happened. A vaguely similar proposal recently suggested that our national parks should be turned over to Native American management entirely. That too is unlikely to happen. But in the meantime, the director of the National Park Service today, Charles F. Sims III, and Secretary of Interior, Deborah Ann Haglund, are both Native American. And individual parks are undertaking many measures designed to enhance Native visibility. Glacier Bay National Park, for example, now features the magnificent Puna Tribal House, celebrating Tlingit culture. At Eastern Washington University, I teach a history course about national park history. The class explores parks around the world, and one of my comparative themes is the way that different countries bring indigenous people into the tourist experience. In the past few years, I've had experiences I can tell my students about how a Bedouin guide showed me petroglyphs on rocks in the Jordanian desert, okay, and how an Aboriginal guide in Australia showed me where, as a child, he went on weeks-long walkabouts in Daintree National Park. I purchased birthday curios from an Indigenous woman in Taiwan's Taroka National Park. She allowed me to film her wishing happy birthday to the curio beneficiary, my granddaughter, speaking in English, then Chinese, and then her native tongue. And at a lodge in Tanzania, my family and I recently played a hilarious game of Frisbee with two Maasai warriors who guarded the camp. While fascinating, such encounters provide only a vague suggestion of the grandeur of Muir's immersion in Tlingit culture. Would that we could go back in time and accompany John Muir and Paul Young with their timid guides deep into the heart of Indigenous Alaska. Alas, that is not to be. But in episodes like these, and in places like Glacier Base, who own a tribal house, we can sometimes, like Muir and Young, stand on the same side of the river, with men and women of other cultures. And that can be just as edifying and as exciting as seeing mountains and glaciers.
Well, thank you. And thank you to all of our speakers who actually came in way under time, so we have plenty of time for questions. If anyone has questions, please raise your hand and then let me know who it is that you'd like to address your question to. The latest speaker, Bill,
Yeah. How do you address the fact that many Native people were forcibly removed from national parks?
Oh, I don't justify that at all. And I don't think they've been consistent with what I'm trying to say is that the Park Service in a variety of ways is trying to reverse that. And for example, in the most specific removal of people from the park was in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. There was indigenous whites who were second, third, fourth generation settlers and removed by the thousands from that area. In terms of the parks, the most specific kind of removal, so to speak, was not allowing Indians to return to native hunting grounds and gathering grounds and so on. And that, in a variety of ways, the parks, as I understand it, they're beginning to allow those indigenous people, their heirs, of course, to return to the park. So I agree that you're raising a very important moral question. I think the direction that we are going now is much more true than it would be.
I have a question for Rebecca. Did you find that Presbyterian missionaries were promoting marriage between indigenous women and non-native men?
No, in fact, just the opposite.
Oh, because Reverend Clarence Twain's wife wrote that she thought the best possible outcome were she had indigenous, they call them foster children. That they were deaf, or sometimes they said adopted children, but actually the Twains ended up moving to Washington State without these so-called children and leaving them in the Wrangell Institute, I believe. But she wrote that she thought that was the best thing that she could hope for those girls. I believe.
Yeah, I wonder if it was, the right sort of husband, but in general, in Southeast Alaska, they were discouraging that.
Rebecca, I'm just wondering, I was lucky enough to get a little bit of funding from our university to go to the Presbyterian Archives in Philadelphia, but I think one of the frustrations, not only has the National Archives been taken away, right, from us, but then there are all these other sources that are really hard. That at the time I went, they had a bunch of stuff on microfilm, and none of it was in Alaska. Not even just copies of it. And I'm wondering if you found one, if it's gotten any better, And two, if there's any effort, or should we be having an effort to look around for these archives hidden in church archives and elsewhere to get them back here, because.
Yeah, well, one interesting thing is at the Presbyterian Historical Society and also at the, the Sheldon Jackson collection in Juneau. Presbyterians didn't keep a whole lot of stuff. They were not really memorializers. And so some of it's a frustration of there aren't like documents that would really answer some questions. But one thing I noticed at the Presbyterian Historical Society is putting more and more documents, like Sheldon Jackson's letters and all these things like online, like with the Internet Archives. And so you can go to the Presbyterian Historical Society site and it's just more and more stuff. It's fantastic. Yeah, I mean, heartrending,
Yeah.
but this stuff is there. Yeah.
Do you know if anyone has questions online? Okay, okay. Messaging? Well, I'm just checking to see if there's questions online. My eyes are really bad, so I can't read them. Okay, well, he's checking. Who had a question out here?
So yeah, so I've read another account of yours trip with the Glinkett by Julie Cruikshank.
Oh, sorry?
Julie Cruikshank wrote another sort of account of John Muir's trip then, that trip with his native guides, and talked about some conflict that happened during that because he had, John Muir had his own reasons for wanting to take that trip, and often driven by his obsession with the mountains and beauty, and not always mindful it might be getting dangerous or whatever. And they finally had to just forcibly say, no, we're not going there. We're stopping. We're going back. And there was some question about, these different agendas, and did he really understand what he was asking them to do and how different it was from why they would have been out there on their own? And so I can comment about it a little bit.
I highly recommend reading this book, and what you've just described is pretty much inaccurate in terms of the interaction between the indigenous people on the canoe and him. There were several places he went to they considered very dangerous, and one was Glacier Bay. And one of the dangers at that time is there's so many icebergs coming off of the mountains that you could easily get crushed between icebergs and so on. And Muir had a guide who had been a sealer, a native guide, who got on the boat with them and went further into Glacier Bay, and that person's wife said, please be very careful, you're taking my husband with you. So they were aware of dangers, but in that story, it actually, the captain was worried about it, but ultimately said, Mr. Muir, you're John, whatever you bring us, good luck wherever you go. And if we get killed, I'd like to go to heaven with you and variation. So I think sometimes there's a tendency to push things a little too far to seeing the dark side of things, and I don't think it works. I think if you read the sources, you'll find that that's just not an accurate account.
Well, these are the sources other than John Muir's own perception, is all I'm saying.
Okay, Ron, anyway.
I've got a question for Dan.
Okay, I hope he can hear you. Dan, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay, Ron has a question for you. Yes, and I can hear you.
You know, Dan, in the Fairbanks paper recently, there's been a story about the repatriation of someone who was at Morningside. This is a real hot issue because Ruchi Steinkruger has been working on the Morningside list for a long time. Are you aware of her work, and can you maybe correspond with her?
Ken, I'm not aware of her work directly, but I have been starting to work with Bob Sams here, and he asked me to start working with him to identify some of the Tlingit people from the Ketchikan Saxman area.
Nietzsche was working with all Alaskans who were committed to Morningside. And so she's been doing this very systematically for probably a period of 5-6 years now. And she's starting to get that pretty interesting information. So I think your specific case out in Ketchikan and that area would really be helpful to her, particularly for someone who's considered a shaman or someone who may be unstable in a different kind of context, using those terminologies to get them committed.
Yeah, Ron, could you email me her contact information? That'd be great. One of the issues that came up just this week when I was trying to work at the state archives is Chris and Leah, two of the state archivists, we pulled out and we looked at the dockets. And so then we had the actual case number, which I haven't had in the past. I've always just had the Morningside side of the discussion. And the first 150 cases in Ketchikan, they don't have at the archives. So all the kind of background court documents, the case files are not there. And Chris is contacting the Ketchikan courthouse, seeing if they have copies of those. But at this point, as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story is kind of in limbo. We don't have those court documents.
Well, we're coming up on our break, so I encourage you to talk to our speakers if you have further questions during the break or the rest of the conference. But I did have just one quick question before everyone claps and gets out of here. Do wolves have souls?
Yeah.
I think so personally, but the answer given, the Indian who asked the question and said, we believe they have souls because they can take tufts of grass in their mouths and swim across in the water and sneak up on a seal or say a deer crossing the water. And so they're very smart. And I think most of us wouldn't feel an intellect necessarily shows that you have a soul, but that was the answer they gave, blending together that